Hello and welcome to another Excel VBA tutorial. In today's video, we are continuing our discussion of pivot tables. So in our last video related to pivot tables, we saw how we can use VBA to take a data range that looks something kind of like this and create a pivot table that looks somewhat like this. So we could create a pivot cache, create that pivot table from the pivot cache, create some fields, arrange the fields, and do some basic filtering. So that was kind of our introduction to pivot tables. In today's video, we are going to now explore a little bit more, not necessarily more complicated, but these are kind of the more infrequent things that we might be doing with VBA. So for example, if we wanted to add a calculated field, maybe we want to add a calculated item field, something like that. Maybe we want to select different parts of our pivot table, or maybe we want to get data from our pivot table, or maybe we want to apply like a top two filter, or maybe a label filter, things along that nature. So that's what we're going to cover in today's video. I still have a couple more videos after this one that we're still going to go into more things related to pivot tables, but this is kind of the next second part for the introduction part. With that being said, I'm going to jump into my VBA editor. So when you get in here, if you're looking at all this code and you're going, this doesn't look familiar, you probably need to watch the first video then, because this is the code that I got from the first video. So this is how we create a pivot table, create the fields, and all that kind of fun stuff. So if this is looking very confusing to you, make sure to go watch that video. I'll make sure to put a link in the description below, but you need to watch that video in order to move on to this video. But since we are now here, we have created our pivot table, we've done our styling and all that kind of fun stuff. The next thing we're going to move into is creating a calculated field. So in this section, we're going to create a calculated field. And with this one, what we do is we go into our pivot table object, and then there is something called the calculated fields method. And then with this one, we can call the add method. So with this one, we can now add a new calculated field. It takes two parameters. The first one is a string that is the name of our field. So my field is going to be called average selling price. And then we have to pass through a formula as a string. And so in this example, what it would look like is it would be equal to gross sales. Now keep in mind, I'm already just using existing fields from my pivot table. These two fields that I'm using in this formula, they already exist in my pivot table, gross sales and units sold. So if you go here and I click on this wonderful little pivot table and I go into the field list, you will see units sold and then gross sales. So I use these two existing fields to create a new calculated field. Now when I run this, you will notice something. It will work fine. You won't see it pop up over here because right now I haven't actually put it in as a field. So I have to now add that new calculated field. So what I'm going to do next is add a new field and then do a little bit of formatting, nothing too crazy. So we're going to now add the calculated field to the table. And so we're going to say with pivot table dot pivot fields, and then we're going to go into the average selling price. It's got to be the name of the field. And with this one, we're now going to work with that particular field. And so now we can just set different properties and methods about it. So with this one, we're going to set the orientation property equal to the Excel data field. So it's a data field. And then I want to make sure that it's the second data field. So this one will be 2 because I already have one there. It's sum of cogs. And then the next one is the number format. So this is how we will format it and it will look. And I'm going to set it to where it has a comma and then my decimal place is right after it. So now if I run it, it should look a little bit more familiar. So we got this little average selling price. Keep in mind, it tries calculating ones and there's no value, so it gives us a divide over 0. So basically like just an error sign. But that's how do we create a calculated field. I'll make another one, and then what we'll do with the second one is we'll take our existing calculated field and then just do, a simple calculation, something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to copy this little section right here. So copy it again, put it down, scroll down a little bit, and then I'll say this one is average selling price fraction or something like that. And then really all I'm doing here is I'm just taking my average selling price and then timesing it by 10%. And then I'll say average selling price fraction. This will be the third data field. And then with this one, again, if I run it, it will now add that third field. So now this one's simply a fraction of our already existing calculated field. So that's taking an existing calculating field and then creating another calculated field off of the existing one. So, just so that way you guys see how you can do it. Okay, so that's calculated fields. Now we're going to move into calculated items. So for example, if I go back to my pivot table, you notice how I had these little countries right here? Maybe I want to create a new item. So maybe I want to add, I don't know, North America. Well, it's a continent, but we'll put it under the country heading for this example. But maybe I want North America to represent the sum of the United States of America, Mexico, and Canada. So in this example, I would be creating a calculated item, which would be the sum of those three countries. So if I wanted to do that, it's very similar to what we would be doing with a calculated field, but there's actually a step we can negate. And so this one, we're going to create a calculated item. Okay. And with this one, it's a little bit different. So we're going to go into our pivot table object. But with this one, we're not going to go directly to calculated items. We're going to go to the field that we want to add the item to. So this one, we have to go to the field that we want to add an item to. In this one case, the field is the country field. And then from here, then it is the calculated items. So this one would be now the calculated items method, and then it would be add. And then from here, we have to then pass through the same two parameters, the name of our calculated item, and then the formula that calculates it. So in this one, I will say North America. And then I'm going to pass through the formula to say, hey, it's Canada plus Mexico plus United States of America. And then with this one, that's all I technically have to do, and we should be able to see it right from here. Okay, so now we have this new calculated item called North America, and that's simply the sum of Mexico, Canada, and then the United States of America. Now keep in mind it's not necessarily formatted exact, so it looks like it's a little bit off, but I don't think it is. Let me see. Mexico and then Canada. Yeah, okay, so it's fine. It was just looking off because of the decimal places. But now it's the sum of those three individual countries. So that's a nice little trick if you want to add your own calculated item, or maybe you want the user who maybe isn't super good with pivot tables or something like that. You could potentially add a macro and do something like that if you wanted to. Okay, so now that we've talked about calculated items, let's move into the get data and get pivot data methods. So for these ones, they return information or values from our particular pivot table, but one does something very different than the other one, or doesn't do something different, but it's treated differently. So the first one is the get data method. So this one, it returns a value from our pivot table. And so how would this one look? Well, if I go into my pivot table object, and then I go to get data, with this one, I have to pass through kind of like the formula to actually go and get the data. And so for this one, maybe I want to go and get the one that is for, let me close my error box. That's fine. Maybe I want to go get the one for the sum of COGS for Canada and then for April. So of course, all the way over here. So the sum of COGS for Canada for April. So I want to get that 1358565. Well, normally here with this one, I would just use that get pivot data formula, and you can see it takes through the field we want to return, the field name, the item, the field, the item, the field, the item. So it's basically like just a smart filter if you want to think about it. But with the get data one, it's just going to return the value. And we write it a little bit differently. Okay, so with this one, what we have to do is we have to say sum of cogs. And then with this, it would be Canada. And I want 2014 April. Now, you don't technically have to put it in this order. I'll show you that even if I put 2014 first and then Canada, it's still exactly the same. And what I'll do is I'll put this in a little message box. And so I'll take whatever values returned to this and then display it to the user. Okay, so it's 135, just like we were expecting. Now, say I put 2014 and then I, get rid of this. So now it's a different order. It's still exactly the same one. So it doesn't matter which order you put them in, they will still work the same. Now with the get data method, it's simply passing back a value. Now with the get pivot data method, it's returning a range object. Two different things. They look like they're almost identical because for the most part, people are just getting the values, but one's returning actually a very different object. And so with this one, if I wanted to, we'll do it kind of the same. We'll put it into a message box. But if I say pivot table, get pivot data, on top of returning a range object, then it's also written a little bit differently. So this one we pass through the data field we want to get. So in this case, it's sum of cogs. And then we have to pass through the field and then the item we want. So the first one would be the country field. And then it would be for Canada. And then the second field would be the year. And then this one would be 2014. And then the third and final field will be month name. And then it would be April. So remember, field, item, field, item, field, item. That's the order it goes into. Now, if I get this one just and leave it just the way it is, we should both get the same exact answers. So we can tell it's still 135. But here's the cool thing. It's technically a range object. So now if I wanted to, we could actually treat it as a range. So if I wanted to, I could say set pivot range equal to pivot table, and then get pivot data. And then I say, hey, pivot range dot address. So something that's unique to a range object. And I wanted to display that to the user. It should work fine. Oh, I have option explicit on. I've got to put that on. So I'd be dim pivot range as range object. See, it returned the address of that range object. So that is showing to you that what was just returned to us is, yes, it can be a value if you want it to, but it's also a range object. So that's the difference between get data and get pivot data. One is returning a value, and then one is returning an actual range object. I'm going to turn off those message boxes so they don't keep popping up. Okay, so that's the get pivot data, and that's the get data. Now we're going to start moving into actually selecting different portions of our pivot table. So with this one, you notice how when you highlight over a pivot table sometimes, like for example, if I go right over the countries, you notice how my arrow is changing direction. So if I select this, it selects France for both, 2014 and 2013. We call this pivot select. So it's selecting the different items within our pivot table. And if I wanted to, I could make it a little bit more specific. And I say, hey, go into 2013 and get Mexico and then highlight this entire section, right? And of course, I have like 10 rows, not rows, but like 20 or 40 columns. But with this one, we can now select and do a pivot select. So this one, we're to select 2013, 2014, Mexico, and Mexico. So this sometimes comes in handy if we want to almost select certain portions of our pivot table based on criteria that we pass through. So we're going to look at the pivot select method. And so with this one, we're going to say pivot select method. And we're going to go into our pivot table object. We're going to go into the pivot select method. And how we pass through this one is we pass through each item, and then we have different objects that we can actually select. So the first one, I want to select the country, and then I want to pass through square bracket and then the name of the country. So it would be France. So I want to select France. And then there's another parameter that we pass through. We can either select blanks, we can select the button, data label, data only, label only. We'll do data and label. And if I run this, you can tell that it selected France for both of these. Now, maybe I just want the data, right? So I don't want the label, right? So I would go Excel data only. So now you notice how it got rid of the label. And then if I wanted to, I could say label only. So label only, and then I run it again. It selected France for both of it. Okay, so that's just doing one criteria. You might want to do multiple criteria, right? All you do is you just pass through the next criteria or the next field basically that you want to select, and then the item that you want to select from that field. And so with this one, it should select France in 2013. So France and then 2013. And again, if I wanted to, I could change this and I could say, hey, data and label, run it again. Now it's selected 2013 and this. Perfect. So that's the pivot select method. Now we're going to actually select the kind of predefined sections of our pivot table in VBA. So for example, if I go and I select different parts of my pivot table. So if I go into my pivot table object, I can go to the data body range and then I can select that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to snap this over here just temporarily. It's going to be a little bit easier to see. So I can select the data range. So this one will select all of that. Ugh. Yeah, sometimes it gets a little stuck, and when that happens, you just have to go to a new sheet. Well, that and also have the pivot select on as well, so that's not helping. Let's try that again. Okay, so this selects the data range, so including the grand total rows and columns. And then if I wanted to, I could go and select the row range. Let's see what that one would look like. So that would select this section. Well, naturally, if we can select the rows, we probably can select the columns, right? I would hope so. And then with this one, it selects the column range, so all that fun information up top. I can select the fields themselves, so the page range, so the filters. Sorry, I think I said fields. So that would select the range for the page range. And then if I wanted to, I could select the entire pivot table. So I could say table range 1. This will not, I gotta remember, one of them selects the page range and the other one doesn't. I think this one doesn't select it. So this selects the entire pivot table minus the page range. And then if you go into the second one, which is pivot table range 2, that one does include the page range. So if I run this one, now it goes up there and it selects all that. So this is really the kind of selecting everything. And if you wanted to delete it, you could do it from here too. Okay, so that's selecting different parts of our particular pivot table. We're going to now move on to the last section, which is talking about like a top 2 filter, or maybe, well, not top 2, like top 10 filter, or maybe I want a label filter. So normally what I do before I start doing anything with filters is I clear all the filters just to make sure that I'm kind of starting from scratch. And with this one, we're going to go into the pivot table and then pivot fields. And then I only have one on right now, and that's just for the month name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, clear all filters, just like that. And so if I run this now, you can tell the little icon is now dropped down just like I wanted it. And I'll comment these out because they've served their purpose. Okay, So let's add a top 2 filter, for example, right? So we'll go into our pivot table and say pivot top 2 filter. Well, how would we normally do that in a pivot table? Well, say I wanted to find the top 2 months for COGS, right? Well, what I would do is I would go here and I would select this drop down. I would go to value filters and then I would say top 10. And here's where you can say, oh, I just want the top 2. And then I want the top 2 items. And then I want it for sum of COGS. And it's going to be applied to the month name. So I'm going to say the top 2 months with the highest COGS. And we can tell that it's October and December. Those are the only 2. So that would be a top 2 filter. So let's see how that would look in VBA. So I would say pivot table, pivot fields. And then with this one, it would again be the month name because this is where I'm applying the actual filter. So this is the field that I'm applying it. I'm going to go into pivot filters. And then I'm going to go into add to. And I'm going to expand this open a little bit just temporarily. And I'm going to say type. Well, the first one is Excel top count. And then the data field. So in other words, what is the data field that I'm looking at to determine the top 2? Well, in this example, it's sum of COGS. So I'm going to copy this little section right here. I'm going to put that right here. And then I'm going to change this to sum of COGS. And then the final one is, well, how many values do you want to return back? So this is kind of the top 2, top 3, top 10. So it's value 1, and then it's equal, and then I want only the top 2. So if I apply this, I ran it. Let's see what we get. So we got October, and then we got December, just like the original example. So that would be being to do like a top 2 filter. Now we can also do label filters. So for example, if I clear my filters, I go back and I want a label filter and I say, hey, anything that contains this little phrase Feb, right? So if anything that contains that, show me that. Well, it should be just February because that's the only month that has anything remotely close to that. So from here, how would this label filter look? Well, it's almost identical. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this. And then I'll say apply label filter. And with this one, it would be an Excel caption contains. And you can always, if you want to, Control J, and you can see technically the different ones you wanted to. So it's really kind of just exploring and seeing what's out here, but this is kind of generally how we would set the filters. And then from here, what we can do is we can actually get rid of this little section right here because we don't need it. And then what we would do is we would change this one from 2 to anything that contains the string Feb. And let me make sure I have my filter off. So let's set it off. And I'm going to run it again. Okay, so it reapplied it just like we were expecting. Perfect. Okay, so that does it for today's video. If you got any questions about what we covered related to pivot tables, filters, selecting it, calculated fields, items, all that kind of fun jazz, make sure to put those questions down in the comments below, and I will try to make sure to get back to you guys. And then also, if you make sure to like the video so that way, other people have a little bit of an easier time finding it. We always appreciate the support that you guys give us, and we hope you guys are enjoying the videos. That's why we do them. And then also, if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you keep getting updates as we release new videos related to VBA and Python. Started a new section today with Python. We're going to start going over how to work with Word documents and then eventually PowerPoint presentations. So it's not going to go into crazy amount of detail because there's not technically a lot we can do compared to VBA, but there's still a lot that we can do, at least from a Python perspective. So kind of want to start exploring that topic. So thanks again for watching, guys. We will see you in the next video.